Turn up the dive, feel the vibe, get ready to ignite. Untold stories in the airways, flying through the night. Experience voices, tales so bold. Streaming live, the truth unfolds. Untold Radio Network, where secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wide variety. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can't hide. Aliens in the attic, UFOs in the sky. Cryptids lurking, oh my, oh my. Ghosts in the hallway, whispering your name. The paranormal, the unexplained. Become a VIP, get the inside scoop. Unlock the mysteries, be part of the group. Live streaming stories are talking to you. Super chats buzzing, join the crew. Untold Radio Network, the secrets come alive. New episodes daily, the mysteries thrive. Great guests, super chat, it's a wild member ride. Share and subscribe, join the side where truth can hide. So if you've got the guts and you want to explore, tune into the Untold, it's what you're looking for. From aliens to ghosts and all that's unseen. Untold Radio Network, where the world's mysteries convene.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, greetings, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and as always, I'm delighted that you're joining me, whether live tonight when we go out on YouTube and Facebook and X, or whether you're watching the show archived on one of those sites later or listening to us on one of the many podcast platforms that this show and all of the other shows on the Untold Radio Network go out on. And if you don't listen to any other shows, if you just listen to Talking Weird or watch Talking Weird, firstly, thank you for watching and listening to my show. But check out some of the other shows. There's so much great content out there, including shows from some very good friends of mine. I haven't plugged them recently, but I love the show so much. I listen to it all the time myself, and that's Down South Anomalies from Jay Katz and his wonderful wife, Aspasia. They were good friends of mine in Sydney, and they're people who really get the strange and the unusual. They've been involved with research for decades, and they're wonderful film curators and just good people. It's a great show. So check that out and some of the other shows on the network. If I'm sounding a little raspy tonight, I'll have to mute myself when I cough. I finally caught my little daughter's cold or flu or whatever she's had, which has been making her cough and feel miserable for the last week. And I'm still smashed with festival work. Both A Night of Horror International Film Festival and Midwest Weird Fest wrapped last week, but I'm still up to here somewhere. For those of you watching, I put my hand above my head, but drowning in work. I'm almost out, another week and I'll be done. But what I'm happy about tonight is I have a guest I've never had on the show before. I've been on his show, and he's just one of the most entertaining people in this field. He's just such a fascinating guy, so funny, so thoughtful. And he's an actor, an improviser who just finished work on Tim Kasher's film, Who's Watching, and is currently working on the film The Dink, produced by Ben Stiller. Recently, he can be seen in Olivia Wilde's new film, Don't Worry, Darling, and the feature film, Snack Shack. They sound great. I have to check those out. He's also, and this will probably interest all of our listeners and all of our viewers, he's also obsessed with UFOs and the paranormal and the occult and all things weird, and he's been that way his entire life. He hosts a fantastic podcast, which I've been lucky enough to be on, called High Strangeness. And I recommend you check that out. In the show notes will be a link to where you can get to it. And it covers these type of topics that he's passionate about. And whenever he has the opportunity, he lectures about Weird Nebraska at conferences and events. And I'm sure we'll be talking about Weird Nebraska tonight, among other things. So I'm delighted to welcome to Talking Weird, the one, the only, Steve Berg.
Hey, Dean. How you doing, brother?
Man, I'm better now. Get to chat to you and relax a little bit.
Good, man. Good.
I know you can carry the show. If I have to mute because I go into a coughing fit.
I got you. I'll vamp. I can talk forever.
Well, man, I know you can. What you been up to since I talked to you last?
Just aside from the boring work stuff, I have been obsessively reading back through old New Fork UFO case files. I'm not sure if I feel like none of people are aware of this, but like New Fork has all their case files listed online, and you can go back to like 100 years and read old UFO reports, and it is absolutely, for a guy like me, just heaven on earth. And so I've been like treating myself to like an hour of those every night and kind of pulling across cases that I find extremely weird and interesting.
So where is this you pull these from? Tell me again.
New Fork, which is the National UFO Reporting Center, and I think Peter Davenport is the dude behind that. But he's been he's been collecting case files and taking reports personally for decades now. And I don't know if it's recently, but he's made these files available for free, which I think is an amazing resource and wonderful to do. So if you're, let's say you live in Iowa, you can look up Iowa cases. I mean, like, they go back like 100 years. I mean, as you're well aware of, UFOs were being seen before 1947. So, I don't know. Wow. I think it's just an amazing resource. I feel like a lot of these pre-1980s cases are super important.
They're also sometimes more interesting, those older cases.
That's actually the case too. They're weirder. The diversity of what people were experiencing, seeing in the sky and on the ground was fantastic. I mean, there was hundreds of different kinds of UFO knots walking off these craft.
I miss those days, man. Like even when I read like what's the book? It was a report originally called The Humanoids. And it's got all kinds of different authors writing these. I think Valet might have, maybe does Valet have a piece in there? A bunch of different UFO writers have pieces in there. And when you read about these old contact cases and UFO report cases, then they haven't become homogenized yet. That really doesn't happen until the ascendancy of abduction lore post, I guess, Close Encounters of the Third Kind and post the Betty and Barney Hill story becoming so prevalent. And then, of course, Whitley Strieber's work and Bud Hopkins' work, and it started to cement this idea of what a UFO encounter, an encounter of the fourth kind with the occupants, was going to be like, an abduction, what it was going to be like. But those older cases, man, there's giant things, little hairy creatures, tin cans, people in like spacesuits. It's fascinating.
Well, I totally agree. I kind of it's almost like in the olden days, especially in the 60s and 70s, that the UFO, what people were seeing on UFOs and on the ground in force weren't that different. Like, a lot of the UFO nuts sound like a cryptid you'd report in southwestern Pennsylvania or the Cascades. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, so I feel like a lot of times they were more monster of the week, which I appreciate. But you're so right. There was this kind of homogenization of it's like the UFO controllers or the big UFO experts, like, hey, we need to come up with a consensus reality about what aliens are. All right. So we're just going to go with the Greys. We auditioned a bunch of different aliens and the Greys got the part. And for me, that's as a kid, I bought that for sure. I was like, oh, well, the Greys are the only legitimate alien race out there, that one that actually does exist. But as you know, when you look into this stuff for a long time and read a lot of books like we have, you're like, that's just not true at all.
I think there was something about the gray extraterrestrials that made more respectable ufologists who'd kind of eschewed the contact cases in the early days anyway. It seems somehow, which sounds so ridiculous when I put it this way, but it seems somehow scientifically palatable, like that
Yeah.
they're these little generic looking gray creatures that kind of look like perhaps what we ourselves might evolve into after using technology and sitting in a cubicle for 2,000 years or 10,000 or 100,000 years, whatever. So there was something about them that, I don't know, and it resonated with us culturally. But you're right, it did take, it's like all paradigms. It took the popular kids in ufology to get on board it at first.
Mhm.
And then that it bled out into popular culture. And before you know it, the little gray extraterrestrial becomes the go-to image in anyone's head when you talk about an alien encounter or an extraterrestrial. Boom, that little gray man pops into everyone's head. It's very
Right.
strange how
Yeah.
and that didn't exist. You're right. Back in the days we're talking about, if you'd said alien back in the 50s or 60s, maybe the generic joke would have been, a little green man with antennas or something. But there was such a diversity in the interpretation of what these things were in UFO literature and science fiction that it hadn't narrowed down, but it did narrow down. And I think there's a paucity culturally for that, to be honest.
Right, right, and I think a lot of people do forget that a lot of what almost probably, and there's better statisticians of humanoids than myself, so take me with a grain of salt. But it does seem to me 'cause I am obsessed with the 60s and 70s UFO contact experiences, and the 50s are interesting as well. But it does seem like, oh wait, hold on, I lost my train of thought. Contactees.
This happens because you and I talk about too many things. And we go
Right,
really
right. No, I
frustrated.
thought I had something interesting. Oh, no, 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 no. What I was going to say was that a lot of what people were reported seeing were actual just human beings coming off the craft who were slightly askew, kind of almost had that Men in Black thing where they're 95% human, but there's something off about them. Do you know what I'm saying? So especially like in the 50s as well. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of these UFO knots were, I mean, they could go to a grocery store and not be go undetected. So it really was all over the place. You had the extreme weird, you had Michelin men, you had like fuzzy balls that were purple, and then you had people who looked, like some dude from Kansas City or some woman from, Manhattan.
Which there's something still super charming about that. Like regardless of the reality of the contactee stories, when even you read that stuff, which we've talked about before on your show, I think, which is loaded with, metaphysical and spiritual kind of connotations and tropes.
Yeah.
But there is still something when you go back and read those reports, which to me, in all honesty, doesn't sound any less ridiculous than an alien abduction story. Like there's nothing innately more ridiculous about a George Adamski contact with, a blonde haired, beautiful space brother than there is with, Joe Sixpack's abduction story where he got probed by a man with, with a little gray body and a big tear-shaped head with black
Right.
almond eyes. Like
Right.
there's nothing inherently which more sensible about either of them, but for some reason one became acceptable to ufology in the main through the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, and the more scientifically respectable, or at least the ufologists who wanted scientific respectability, were happy to throw overboard all of those earlier contactee cases, which seem to be more benevolent and seem to look more like us. So it's funny how the bias drifted to it had to be weirder and more sci-fi and more experimental. There was
Right. Right. Well, it makes you wonder, Dean, like, is it like, I guess if we were to suppose there's something genuine about the UFO phenomenon, which I do think there is, I just don't think anyone has the right answer yet. And I think the government doesn't know either. But it does seem like there is, oh my God, I did it again. I forgot what I was going to say. What's happening to me? I'm losing my brain.
Well, while you're thinking, I'll tell you, Flat Rockland, a regular listener and viewer of the show, thank you, Flat, said he'd been racking his brain trying to work out where he last saw you. And then he says it was drunk history. Yes.
Yes, I did a lot of drunk history back in the day. Very fun. It was very fun. I can't remember what I was saying about UFOs. I mean, I'm sorry. I like it's just, it's interesting. I guess I think what I was saying was, how it evolves, throughout, let's say, the last 200 years. We've seen it evolve actually quite a bit, from what people see, like we're talking about, from what people see in the sky to people's perception of the phenomenon. And you wonder, is it are we part of the evolution? Are we causing this stuff to change as we become more technologically proficient and make gains, and we evolve ourselves or devolve ourselves, however you want to look at it? But it does seem, kind of go back to you and I think talked on my show about Greg Bishop's co-creation hypothesis.
Right.
And no one can say for sure, but it's an idea I entertain a lot.
It rings so true, the idea that we are responsible for some type of input into this anomalous phenomenon that we're experiencing. And maybe and I'm not sure how it works, whether it's just some kind of psychological mirror which reflects back to us what we expect to see, or whether it actually does somehow transform in pace with our cultural expectations. These are things which I think are impossible for any of us to determine. But when you look at the cultural development of this, like you were talking about earlier, how the cases have been going long since before 1947, which most people think of as the starting point,
Right.
and how they seem to keep pace with both our scientific expectations, our cultural expectations, our popular cultural tropes. It's very difficult to look at this phenomenon and not say somehow it is responding to what we expect, both culturally, psychologically, scientifically, on all these levels.
Yep.
So I think Bishop's if anybody hasn't read that article by Greg Bishop, it's in the late Robbie Graham's UFOs Reframing the Debate, which has a number of fantastic articles by people,
Great
or
book.
chapters by people. It's definitely worth checking out. So I'm glad you brought that up, Steve. It's good to remind people to go read that piece.
Yeah, it's a great one. Great one. One of the great modern, and it's all kind of like new. It's just thought experiments on these topics. No one's reinventing the wheel, but they're kind of like making like a fake argument in court for why it could be this or that. And I just think it's interesting. A lot of what Greg and I have become good buddies over the years, and we both kind of feel that like art is definitely like a huge part of how either we express the phenomenon or the phenomenon expresses itself, or maybe a combination of both. But I feel like art really is so important, and especially with the culture of UFOs, which is just important as a phenomenon itself. I think how it affects society affects us. I mean, why we're talking right now. I mean, the UFOs are kind of this entree into talking about bigger ideas. It's like I think it was Jeffrey Kripal who said, when you get into UFOs for the first 2 years, you read UFO books. On year 3, you start reading about Arabian mystics from 2,000 years ago. And it's so true. Like, at least for me, it is.
Yeah, I think for us to progress in our journey, and all of us individually and collectively in this space, it's important to look at the phenomenon outside of the popular tropes of the phenomenon, to look at other things which seem similar and across the paranormal board. I think that's how, and I'm a pessimist to the extent that I never think we're going to solve any of this. And that doesn't mean I think it's a bad thing. I just don't think we're going to solve any of it. I don't think we're meant to solve any of it. But I think if we even want to start asking the right questions and making some sense of the impact that it has on us and that we have on it, if we just keep looking at very plain UFO cases, we're not going to get any closer. So you do have to broaden out, like you've suggested, like Greg suggested. I couldn't agree more. What we should do, though, maybe we can use that broadening out as a segue into, because I really want to hear about this. You said you've been investigating some old UFO cases in Nebraska.
Yeah. In fact, there's one that I just got some really great clarity on that I've been interested in for a little bit. I could tell you about that one.
I'd love to.
Yeah. Okay, so this happened in 1975, and it is about, I live in Omaha, which is, the biggest city in Nebraska, and, it's like 1 million people, whatever. And but about 2 hours northwest of Omaha, there's these little tiny towns, and between the towns of Belden and Laurel, Nebraska, I mean, these are like basically villages of like maybe 800 people. In 1975, this man was driving, and first off, it's important to give a little context. This guy, he was I have now found out who he was. I knew he was a well-known person in Los Angeles, but his family owned a bunch of land in Nebraska, and he was kind of there seeing to the land or like selling off a piece, doing some kind of business. But he was a big car dealer in Los Angeles, like huge. He was like one of the first big sponsors of the Indy 500. And he was a very wealthy, very successful guy, and he was big in the car world. Like, he was a very known entity. His name was Robert Estes. I just found that name out 2 days ago, by the way. So I've been making all these this headway in this case. Anyway, he was driving, and he normal night. He landed in Sioux City, Iowa, stopped and got something to eat, and was going to drive to, I can't remember the name of the town, but he was driving through Laurel on his way there. And as he's driving, he sees this white light. You've heard this a million times. And the white light kind of drops down, and it drops all the way down in the road in front of him. And it's got like a shaft of light. And as it's hovering there, it drops all the way down in front of the shaft of light. And it looks, and so, Robert Estes stops his car. He stares at the thing, and he said, it looks like a mini tank. And a door opens, and then so he kind of gets out of his car to like look at this thing, go, what the hell? And then this door opens. This man who looks totally human walks out and goes, and says to Robert Estes, he goes, I bet you didn't think you'd see that, huh, Bob? Says his name in plain English, like he's like their old like army buddies, gets back in his ship, takes off. Robert Estes is in complete shock. And so, he gets back in his car. He's a car guy, by the way. He like used to race cars. So he goes like 90 miles per hour, and he knows these back roads. He grew up in the area. He is cruising. Next thing you know, this thing is right on top of him, pacing him all the way to the town of Belden. Then it zips off. He gets out, and right away he gets to his hotel, and he calls Newfork. I think it was Newfork. It might have been Kufos who he reported to. But that night, he actually called and reported. And I just found the recording. The original recording of him like 25 minutes after this happened to him. And it's just it's a really crazy case, and kind of how you're talking, so weird. Like a mini tank UFO that could like fly at ungodly speeds and do all these crazy maneuvers. And then when it lands, it looks like an army tank, and like just like a normal white dude walks out and says, hey, bet you didn't think you'd see that, Bob. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, Dean, in the 70s. I like cases like that. They're funny, they're weird. But
it reminds me, funnily enough, of the kind of first Woody Derenberger Ingrid Cold case, where you'd have these cases back then where something would land and somebody would come out and be fairly normal in their engagements with you.
Kind of friendly and chummy and polite.
Yeah.
It's hilarious to me. I love it. I actually do find like I'm never laughing at anyone's trauma, but I do think these 60s and 70s cases weren't as sinister as like the 80s and 90s UFO abduction scenario. A lot of times they were funny and absurd and almost operated like a David Lynch film, kind of with dream logic. And I think that's what I miss. Look at me, I'm like an old man, harkening back to the old UFO days.
Man, the lynching comment's so funny because I just put a comment up from Bob Antone saying that he and his wife Laura is here. So Bob and Laura obviously have significance in Twin Peaks. But here's the weird thing: they actually live in the real Twin Peaks.
Snoqualmie?
Yeah. Well, what is it? North Bend.
North Bend, yeah.
I'm there, and at the festival
there.
where we just did the Eraserhead retrospective David Lynch tribute screening, a little over a week ago, we played a film from Bob and Laura where they talked about the local area and their engagement in being there when the series was being filmed, and Bob was also a projector at the North Bend Theater for the US premiere of Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. So it's weird that when his comments on the screen, you make a David Lynch Twin Peaks.
And they're Bob and Laura. That was like a triple synchronicity.
Man, super weird.
That was awesome.
Super weird. But you're right. There is something about that lack of sinisterness. And I wonder if that has something to do with so much of the alien abduction narrative became attached to the same type of methodology, the almost pseudo-psychological or pseudo-scientific methodology of recovering memories, and how much of that actual mythology, and I don't mean that dismissively, but that's what it became, how much of that traditional alien abduction narrative is the result of something happening to the individual, not necessarily in the actual experience with the other, but on the couch of some quasi, psychologist
Yeah.
trying to elicit a response which fits this growing pattern of extraterrestrial alien abuse.
You literally just took the words out of my mouth. That's exactly what I was going to say. I don't fault any experiencer for getting regressed, especially like in the 80s and 90s and even today, whatever. Like, I don't blame them because popular culture has told them that's the right thing to do. I, however, like sort of see regression hypnotherapy as differently, where I feel like, I mean, I'm not trying to talk ill of the dead about a guy like Leo Sprinkle or Bud Hopkins. Like, they were specifically looking for something. They had an agenda. They were asking probing questions. And we know this because like we these are facts now. Like this isn't my this isn't my just hypothesis on this. We know they were doing that. Even in the books of like Bud Hopkins, I was recently like paging through. I think it was oh God, what was it? I can't remember his first book. It's famous.
Is it Missing Time or
that's it? Yes, I was paging through that, and he talks about he asks questions in that when he kind of like replays the thing. I'm like, you're literally asking them if an alien came through their wall. Like, I mean, you're putting these ideas in their head. So I never fault the experiencer, but I do agree with you that I do wonder if the hypnotic regression thing was a huge catalyst for the homogenization of what people would say about their experience.
There's no doubt. I knew Bud ever so briefly. I communicated with him some, and I spent a little bit of time with him at Fort Fest 1999. He was a charming man. Obviously, he was super charismatic, but he was one of those people that you could tell did not want to be questioned. Like when we were having breakfast together with a couple other people, I made some comment about, how I think his speech, the thing was about marks on experiences or he would have said abductee.
Right.
John Mack would have said experiencer, but on abductees' bodies. And I said, do you see a commonality that, for example, with witches' marks in, the medieval period, that these other people who had contact. And anyway, and then I think it went into, probably driven by me, into fairy lore and the like. And then he got super, not angry, but he got very, even defensive is the wrong word. He got very assertive that was wrong. And he said that this has nothing to do with fairies. There's no pot of gold at the end of any rainbow in these stories. And I'm thinking, I didn't want to argue anymore because I was there as an academic interviewer. I wasn't there to change somebody's mind. I was just throwing ideas out. But anybody who's familiar with fairy faith lore knows there's no rainbows and pots of gold at the end of these stories anyway. They're all hideous, horrible, weird stories that you're lucky if you walk away from alive after you've dealt with it.
That's exactly right.
And his wife later said, I've got the piece somewhere. His ex-wife said something along the lines of how she was shocked that Bud and his colleagues had no knowledge of other religious systems or any other belief systems outside of alien abduction law. Like, she thought the first obvious thing to do would be to which you and I would agree with, was to have this broader idea, but he didn't. And on that, and then I'll finish it because I'm not being interviewed by you. I want to interview you, but I also talked to an experiencer on that trip somewhere else who was one of Bud Hopkins' original patients, or no, patient's the wrong word because he wasn't technically a medical professional, but one of his original abductees. And she said that she'd had an experience and she remembered parts of the experience very clearly, but she could never remember what the beings were like she had contact with. And she said, and I've got this on audio tape, she said, in fact, I probably don't have the tape anymore, but I used to. It's in my dissertation anyway. She said, that he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and I finally told him what I knew he wanted to hear. Little gray man, big heads, black, teardrop shaped eyes. She couldn't even remember what the things were, but now she entered the mythology as somebody who'd had an experience with these beings that had been decided upon by people like Hopkins and Jacobs and, everybody else. So, something very strange happened and changed the narrative, changed perhaps even changed the experiences themselves after this became implanted in what we would expect.
Yeah. And it's one of these things I've sort of had to come to terms with, because a lot of the cases I grew up as a kid loving involved hypnotic regression. And now, I mean, especially like the, the Herbert Schirmer case in Nebraska, where the police officer had this dramatic experience. Think he had his experience, but weeks later, when Leo Sprinkle put him under hypnotic regression, he had all these new memories that went along with the sort of popular narrative at the time. And people who love that case kind of like get down on me because I'm like, I believe half his story, the other half is suspect to me. I'm not saying I totally throw it out, but the memories in his story involve hypnotic regression, and I just don't. I mean, like, look, we don't trust in the court of law, so why should I just like with an act of faith believe that a man like Leo Sprinkle, who had I mean, like, I love a lot of the cases he was involved with, but we can't deny the fact that he had a history of implanting ideas in people's heads. I mean, like, that's just the truth.
Yeah, it's a good point with Sprinkle, because he's not often spoken about the way that Hopkins and Mack and Jacobs, and as Bob Antone just said, that he and his wife watched Communion today, and
Totally.
that clearly there's no doubt, but Bob's absolutely right. Whitley had a massive impact on the direction.
Changed the game. It was like a new chapter when Whitley came around.
But we do talk about Whitley. We don't often talk about Sprinkle, but you're right. The fact that he's involved in so many of these cases.
So many that we love. Yeah.
It's problematic, it becomes how much of this is the therapist researcher,
right,
and how much of it is the experiencer.
He was also, I mean, he was a, professor at the University of Wyoming, and he was fired from his job for questionable practice. So, I mean, like, a lot of people, and it's not just UFOs. It's like people who love certain movies and, are fans of a certain thing, whether it's art, UFOs or Bigfoot, whatever. You really, if you're, an honest researcher or an honest, like, connoisseur of this stuff, you really do have to be honest with yourself and question some of these older cases that you love so much that got you into the UFOs in the first place. It doesn't mean you can love them any less or that you take the subject any less seriously, but like, I do think it's important to go back, and because a lot of these older stories have influenced how people talk about UFOs today. And I see that a lot with people kind of getting into UFOs now, where they're like talking about Richard Doty like he's some secret keeper and telling the truth. And I'm like, folks, like, he was a paid disinformant, like, for a living, like, made a man go crazy. So I just think people need to be careful,
Yeah, it's funny how, well, it's because some things are self-serving in the way that they build up somebody's belief system. I think somebody who's deeply entrenched in any belief system,
Agreed.
Not just one about flying saucers or UFOs or extraterrestrial life, but any belief system, people are innately more likely to want to believe a story from somebody that seems to feed into that belief system. They don't want to butt into cognitive dissonance, because it's a horrible thing when somebody tells you it's all falling apart. And the Doty story and the William Moore story is such a great example. When William Moore, who was an asset of Richard Doty, who was an AFOSI agent, you're right, who kind of was involved in the Paul Benowitz affair. That's a whole nother story. But when William Moore came out to say, who was America's probably leading ufologist at the time, came out at the MUFON Symposium in 1989 and admitted he was an asset of the AFOSI and Richard Doty, and admitted that they'd been feeding the UFO community disinformation and spying on them. This is the guy who writes the first Roswell book.
Yeah.
This is the guy who is front and center in so much of the stuff that comes out in that kind of key period where ufology spirals into X-Files UFO belief, really, into total paranoia. But while people screamed at him on stage and threatened to get a fire hose and blast him off the stage, and people were yelling and crying, they didn't walk away after 1989 going, well, we better reassess all this stuff about crash sources and, back engineered craft and deals with extraterrestrials and all this. No, what happened is the UFO community doubled down on those beliefs, and then we get the X-Files for another decade plus. It becomes the ascendant, up until today, it becomes the ascendant version of ufology. So the cognitive dissonance there was so strong that they screamed at the messenger, but they even after he admitted essentially, well, we've been playing you, they still believed the game, you know?
Yeah. And the thing is, it wasn't just like one man's word. Like, Willie Moore had the receipts, like this happened. This is a part of history. But you're so right. And so like I feel like there's, people are into different, UFOs and Forteana for different reasons. And I'm not in it, like you said, like I don't think in my lifetime or ever we'll find out what this stuff is or represents. I think maybe the mystery is the point. And I'm okay with that because I'm addicted to mystery. Mystery is what gets me out of bed in the morning, man. But like I do think like there is these people who feel like they just have to get past human gatekeepers, be it the government, military, whatever you want to call it, CIA, government agency. And then once they can get past those gatekeepers, the truths of the world will be. Now, what a good thing for a control system to make people believe that they have, right? Like that they have these omniscient gods of ufology that can answer the question of, are we alone? Like they will never give up that mystery or that illusion. It's very beneficial to them. So
Absolutely.
like, I think people are barking up the wrong tree with UFO activism. I mean, like if that's your bag, rock on, man. But like, I'm into the weird stuff.
Man, now I want to go down that spiral.
Yeah.
It's one of my pet topics of the idea that a community that hasn't trusted the US government for 80 years now expects that all the revelations are going to be given to, and the only revelation they're going to be happy with is if they are told exactly what they already believe. Like if you already believe that, why are you so determined that the US government has to tell you that a saucer crashed in Roswell, they recovered the debris, they back engineered it, they met the little gray man? That's already what you believe. So if somehow disclosure was something entirely different, they wouldn't believe it anyway. The only disclosure they're going to believe is if it fits the narrative, which is nutty. Anyway, this is my wheelhouse and I love it and I can tell it's yours as well. But we should use that kind of your love of weirdness to segue into something we kind of teased or promised in the show notes, and that's Weird Nebraska. Can you tell me? Let's just segue into some weirdness from Nebraska because that isn't my wheelhouse. And I need to know more about it.
Yeah. No, I'd be happy. I'll give you like a little sampler platter, if you will, just a little something from each. Well, so I've always been to Nebraska lore, but I lived in LA for 20 years, which that's longer than I lived in Nebraska. But a few years ago, I moved back to Omaha, where I'm from, and I kind of have made it my business to really immerse myself in the little microcosm of Eastern Nebraska and Nebraska and kind of the surrounding Midwest states, but mostly Eastern Nebraska and actually, I'll say mostly Nebraska. But when when you go on Google and you start rooting around Google and you look up paranormal Nebraska UFOs, you'll find stuff, but like it's not overwhelming and it's not that impressive. I was kind of bummed out. But then I started opening up my research tools, going on newspapers.com, talking to historians, calling librarians of little towns. And Dean, I have found a treasure trove. Wow. At first, I thought this was a state that was just kind of like mild in terms of high strangeness. I was so wrong in terms. And in fact, like I almost think like every place is just as weird as the next, but it just hasn't been uncovered yet. But Weird Nebraska. So I will tell you one of my favorite stories. This happened in 1957 in Falls City, Nebraska. And there was a man, and this is a pseudonym, by the name of Mr. Hanks. And Mr. Hanks was driving into Falls City, which is a tiny little town with a car full of groceries. And as he's approaching the town, he sees something flying way up in the sky. He's like, oh, that's weird. Looks like a large bird. Maybe the turkey cranes are coming through. Then it starts dropping down really fast, and he kind of slows his car down to an idle, watches this thing, and it's like flopping around. It looks like a giant bird, but it's like looks like it's having some serious problems, like it's injured or something like that. So then he kind of gets out of his car to get a closer look, and this thing drops down, really flies over him, probably like 30 feet, and he sees what it is. It is not a bird. It is a 9-foot tall tan creature with a wrinkly skin, piercing blue eyes. He said it was demonic looking. It had wings, but these weren't organic wings. It was like a harness with leather shoulder straps, and on his chest was like an old computer panel, and it was flipping dials and turning knobs. Looking, he in what he assumed it was trying to do was course correct and fix his like wobbly trajectory. And so as this thing is starting to get wobbly, it gets really low to the ground and close to Mr. Hanks, and Mr. Hanks goes paralyzed. Not with fear, but like literally physically paralyzed, cannot move. And he watches this thing. He is just absolutely horrified, beyond scared. And the creature ends up like turning a knob, fixing its flight pattern, and flies off. And then Mr. Hanks, what he said kind of about after this happened is that he was so messed up that he never would not dream about it the rest of his life. He ended up taking 2 jobs, working a graveyard shift, and just kind of becoming like a self-imposed insomniac, like not sleeping at all. Wow. And he said this thing had such an impact, such a negative impact on his life. But I love a flying wing humanoid story. But what I love about this is that technology, like weird, crude technology was involved. And it was wearing like a shoulder strap of wings. I mean, it's so bizarre to me. I just love that case, and I can't remember where
what year was that again, Steve? What
year 57. Valet actually mentions the story in maybe it's Dimensions, and then Keel I think mentions it in Operation Trojan Horse as well. But yeah, it's been covered by a number of researchers and a number of books, but it's just one of my favorites because it's so bizarre.
Yeah, and that's exactly the type of story that perhaps before when we were saying ufologists need to broaden what they look at. Yeah. Like there's these weirder things which are tangential and perhaps might give us a clearer insight. And that's why Verlaine Keel and you are also great, because you understand that this is all somehow mixed up in the weird.
It feels like it is to me, it just does. Let me give you another one that I would consider a UFO. You can tell me if afterwards if you think this would be a UFO case.
Sure.
But in 1906, right outside this town called Ord, Nebraska. I'm not even sure if Ord actually exists. I think the capital city of Lincoln might have swallowed it up, but it's really like 40 minutes away from where I am right now. But in 1906, these 3 boys were playing outside of their home. They lived on a farm, and I think everyone had their parents over, so their parents were all friends. They were inside eating dinner, probably playing bridge or something. The kids were outside playing. It was, early evening, and they see this large white like object that looked like the moon. And they said it was as big as the moon in the sky, but then really quickly it zipped down and hovered right above them. And within this circle was a giant woman who they called the Moon Woman. And the way it was described almost sounds like the fairy princess from Wizard of Oz.
Wow.
But this woman was like smiling at him, and like they said they got this like really great, like euphoric, happy feeling, like this was some kind of like grandmotherly figure. And it was like apparently a beautiful woman too. Well, anyways, they go inside and they, get their parents to come out. And when of course, when the parents come out, the object is gone and the woman is gone. And then the newspaper article, because there's actually a newspaper article about this, and like I can't remember what the actual newspaper. I had that clipping, but at the end it says, "We're not really sure what the kids saw. Maybe they ate something bad." I was like, it's amazing. They had some bad mutton, and all of a sudden they're seeing moon women.
There's a Fatima element to that as well.
Very much
because
so.
of the kids, the sun moving. Here it's the moon moving, the beautiful woman associated with it.
Right around the same era too, and this is right after, like, in 1896 and 1897, Nebraska was at the forefront. Like they were getting hit heavy with the flying airship situation. And those flying airships didn't just stop in 1897. They were kind of going into the early 1900s. So this almost leads into like this is the oldest UFO case that's airship that I can find in Nebraska. So this is almost like a new iteration. But like just because it was a woman coming down, like I still think it was an unidentified flying object,
I think all of this stuff, as we've said, is far more interrelated than we might imagine it to be. So yeah, you see a spherical or circular shape, and then there seems to be some entity attached to it. Today we have the science fictional trappings of a flying saucer and a beautiful woman, which would have fit perfectly with what so many of the contactees were saying.
Right.
But before we had that language, it's a moon thing. It's something else. There's a certain more of a mystical thing to it. And I'm sure, I don't know if Valet or Keel ever saw that, but I'm sure instantly their little eyes would have, would have blown up if they saw that, because it fits the pattern.
Right. Well, in fact, I got this case from I'm on this I guess it's like a message board newsletter, but it's was created by Chris Aubeck, who did Wonders in the Sky with
He's
Valet. And
fantastic. I love
Valet is
Chris.
part of this forum. I mean, anyone can join. I can't believe like I get emails from Jacques Valet sometimes saying like he found a new clipping. But like I got this clipping and Valet was commenting on it. Valet really liked this case. And so I was like, whoa, and it happened in Nebraska. And I'm like,
I'm not at all surprised. Man, I got to get on that news list. I like Chris Aubeck. I don't want to say he's a good friend of mine because I don't know him that well, but I consider him a friend. I really like Aubeck. I think he's up there with like Greg Bishop, Joshua Cutshern. And there's probably half a dozen people. There's not many who are still doing the good work in this space. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, to collate and get all these academics from all over the world to find, look for, and send in and categorize and file all these kinds of UFO reports in antiquity and pre-1940, that is extremely valuable work. Extremely valuable work. Like, I think, like, that is stuff we can actually do. Like, I don't think, like yelling at your senator about UFO disclosure with all the other problems we have going on in the world is going to get you very far. But I think if you can contribute one old article like to this, I mean, it just, like you said, it helps us ask better questions. And it helps us, compare and contrast and maybe even find patterns. Like, I don't know. I just think this is the real work, like
I agree.
Talk about this stuff. Let's move on to Bigfoot. I'm going to give you kind of some recent cases that have happened in the last 18 months. So about a year ago, there was I got a message from somebody because now that I have this podcast, people send me Weird Nebraska stories, which is fantastic. And I got a message saying like, hey, supposedly there's a little river town called Blair, Nebraska, and there had been a few sightings in one night of a Bigfoot. And I'm like, okay. This actually this happens to be pretty close to where Bigfoot's been reported for a long time.
I'm just going to stop you quickly. Joshua Cutchin just commented and said, do not besmirch Aubeck by comparing him to my shenanigans. Thank you so much for listening, Joshua.
We love Joshy C. But in Blair, Nebraska, so there were these reports, and so I was like, oh, very interesting. I was trying to find out where people saw it, get more information. I was unable to do it. But it just happened that the next day I was going out to Oakland, Nebraska to take photos of these different spots where this town in 1975 had a lot of Bigfoot sightings for about 6 weeks. Tons of people saw Bigfoot. So I was taking some photographs of these old barns and cemetery where people saw that. On my way back, I'm like 10 miles away from Blair, Nebraska. Somebody calls me, goes, hey, I've got a location for you in Blair where someone saw it. I was like, whoa. I'm like, weird. I happen to be right by Blair, Nebraska. I've never even been to this place, but synchronistically enough, I was right by it. Anyway, they say it was seen and reported at the Dollar General on the outside of town. And immediately I was like, well, I guess I'm going to the Dollar General right now. And so I literally, with 10 minutes, drove there 10 minutes after I found out, walk into the Dollar General, and I'm like, what am I doing? I'm a grown man. This is crazy. But I go to these two women who are stocking shelves. I'm like, hello, ma'am. My name is Steve Berg. I'm a writer from Omaha, Nebraska. Perchance have you heard about a Bigfoot sighting around here? And they kind of look at me like, and then a lady from the register comes over and puts her hand up in the air like she's raising her hand for a question and goes, I was the one who reported the Bigfoot. And I was like, wow, okay. And so her and I start talking, and she said they were closing up the store, and it was like 10 o'clock, I think, around thereabouts. And one person at the end of the night goes around to the front door and just manually pulls on the door just to double check it's locked. And she said, as she was doing that, she looked around the corner of the store, and there was an 8-foot tall, hairy covered man, classic Bigfoot, playing peekaboo with her around the corner of the store. And then she, obviously freaks out and then runs around to the back of the store, gets in, and then they call the cops. The cops come and clear the area. But apparently, she told me this, the cops said they had 2 reports. One that was 5 blocks away and then one that was down by a park near the railroad tracks. Now, another weird thing about Blair, Nebraska is about 5 years ago on YouTube, this kind of went viral. There was this supposed, alleged recording of a Union Pacific Railroad conductor driving and saying, like, you can hear him in the background honking, and sort of like, burr, burr, burr. We're seeing like a Bigfoot type creature like by the tracks. Do you guys know anything about this? It's like a 30-second recording. I've never been able to track the veracity. I've tried to get a hold of the person who posted it originally, but it is right by. So if this is, because you can tell he announces where he is in this recording, and it was right by where someone said they saw the Bigfoot recently, like a year ago. So that was a fun case. It's still kind of ongoing. I'm talking with the lady still, who is one of the witnesses, and like, I mean, who knows? I can't prove anything, but like, she seemed genuinely freaked out by what happened. Like, when I talked to her, I mean, like, she was having problems. It ended up being where the manager came out and started going, no, sir, you have to leave, because I was causing a bit of a scene accidentally, because other people in the store were starting to come up. And then she's like, you have to leave. And then I walk outside, and I'm trying to make a video by the dumpster, and like, and back, she comes out and kicks me out, and I'm like, I'm in my car driving home. I'm like, man, I'm a guy in his mid-40s, like, getting kicked out of Dollar Generals in Blair, Nebraska. What am I doing? Like, grow up.
It's weird that we live in this transformed postmodern landscape where Dollar Generals are now so prolific that people are seeing Bigfoot near them in rural areas. But it's so weird when this is totally unrelated, but not totally unrelated. When I drove to Summit, Arkansas to shoot the bit about Richard Shaver when he moved there, and I had my girlfriend and we had two of our daughters with us, my daughter and one of her daughters. We were in the middle of nowhere. Nowhere's open. There's no food. There's nothing. But a light up ahead. What is it? Freaking Dollar General, and it's open. Baby. It's the middle of nowhere. It's like these things are. So this is the new landscape.
They're liminal. I swear to God, they're always by themselves. They're never in a strip mall. They're like off the side of roads, interstate roads. They're like, small country roads, and then they're there, and then there's nothing around them a lot of times.
So maybe we're going to see more UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings and weird tales happening around the Dollar Generals going.
They're window areas, window stores.
Maybe this is something you've stumbled upon first, Steve. This might be a new thing.
Hey, I'm if I can be the one to break the Dollar General conspiracy, hey, God bless.
There's a book that, in 10 years, there'll be like a book like Dollar General,
right?
Like Big sightings or something.
Right. Kutchin, this is your next book if you're listening still.
And incidentally, Josh is about to drop a new book, right? It's called Four Wall Phantoms.
Yeah, I'm so excited about it. Like, I know what it's about, and it is exactly like the book I want to read right now. Like, it's the stuff I'm really into. So Josh is always like ahead of the curve. Like, I feel like, he's like 2 years ahead of what I'm going to get into. So he's a good friend of mine. I love Josh, and but he's one of the big forward thinkers we have right now. Like, really, like, I mean, like, I think when Josh came around, I got back into Fortean in a new way again, where I was like, oh, I always loved this stuff. It's actually never drifted away from my life since I was a kid. But when Josh came around, and some other writers, around Josh who were probably inspired by him, I fell in love with these topics all over again, because I do think comparative analysis, like Josh has done so brilliantly with all his books, is stuff we can do. It is a way we can get ahead.
We have to read Joshua's current comment up there. He says, George P. Hansen would say something about Dollar General and socioeconomic levels. I say that with no judgment, who has spent plenty of time in Dollar Generals. Dollars General?
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that it's the closest store to where I live in the middle of nowhere. My daughter and I shop at our local Dollar General. Or we shop there so often that the manager who's there, like, it seems like she's there 24/7. She never leaves. Lovely lady. Her and my daughter are friends now. Like, we'll go in, and my daughter will take toys to show her and do drawings to give her. And it's becoming a part of the American landscape.
Yeah, I mean, she'll be over for Thanksgiving before you know it, man. I mean, pass the gravy, Dollar General friend. So
I wouldn't even joke. I actually asked a lady who worked at the other closest store to us, a gas station, one year to Christmas, because she wasn't going anywhere. She didn't want to, though. But she's a lovely lady. But
you're a good man. I like that.
Well, that's what the holidays are about.
I agree, man.
Right? And is it Fourth Wall Phantoms? Is that the name of Josh's book? Yeah.
It is. It is. Unless
Josh, let's get you on as soon as you're ready to talk about that as well.
yeah,
I'd love to do
I'm
that.
gonna make him come on my show too. Everyone's gonna want a piece of Joshy Cutchin coming up real soon.
He's going to get so sick of it. I know when Ecology of Souls came out, man, I could tell he was just like another podcast.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean,
Because everybody did want him.
The promotional grind is real, though. It's but it's part of it. You gotta do it.
Yeah, that's true. So what I love it that you have a Bigfoot story from there. What other, and you say you've had like a kind of a quasi Fatima UFO story. You've had like a winged humanoid. You've had a Bigfoot. What's another Weird Nebraska thing?
Well, I'm a huge fan of ABC's The Alien Black Cats, and boy, do we have a sweet old history of that. So I have articles going back to the earliest one I have is 1896. And it is about this. Actually, it's a particular area of Nebraska that is my favorite area because the history is just so off the charts with high strangeness. But it's in Odo County, Nebraska, in the late 1890s. People were seeing a large black panther, very big black cat, and it was going around killing livestock. It kept on going around a schoolhouse and circling a schoolhouse. It happened like 2 times and then freaked out the teacher and the students about. I mean, they were having to stay there till dark. And then the men would come off with shotguns and shoot it away so they could get the kids out. It rose into such a fever pitch where the mayor of the town, who was wealthy, I believe he was related to the Morton Salt family. I'd have to check my notes on that, but I believe he was. Anyway, he was a rich man. He hired all these farmers, got them shotguns and torches, and they went out looking for this thing night after night, but couldn't find it. And then it kind of went away, and it would kind of come back again. But the black cat thing has kind of been with Nebraska for a long time. In the 1980s, there was a big rash of black cat sightings around Iron Horse Wildlife Management Area. And it was a popular place for people to hunt, hike. It was really beautiful. There was lakes for fishing, or is. And people were seeing these black cats with somewhat of a regular frequency. And it got this one man, and I cannot remember the man's name. I'm sorry, I don't have my notes in front of me. But this one man was so incensed that the game warden, the fish and parks, and the police were doing nothing about it, that he wrote a letter, this long letter, which I have the letter actually, to Senator Exxon at the time, the senator of the state senator of Nebraska, and was saying like, you son of a bitch up in your ivory tower. Oh, I'm sorry if I curse. You son of a gun in your ivory towers in DC, not helping us with this Black Panther problem. Kids hike out there. And he went just nuts. It's like a 4-page letter raving about how angry it is that no one's coming to deal with this problem of alien black cats. And I love it. And we have, the Midwest has a great, Kansas has a lot of sightings, Iowa does, Wisconsin does. And
yeah,
so
we did the late Linda Godfrey, such a lovely lady. We did
oh yeah,
the world premiere of her feature documentary that she directed with her son called Return to Wildcat Mountain, which was about black cats in the driftless area.
Oh,
and
wow.
When we screened that, and Linda and her son were there, and we had some side talks which Linda did as well, and Eau Claire, which was great. But I didn't know they were coming, and witnesses from the film came to see. And when you talk to these people, these aren't like city slickers who might have mistook, like, I don't know, a domestic cat or, a raccoon or a bear for a black panther. These are people who've spent their whole lives in a rural environment, hunting and farming, and they know what they see when they're out in the middle of, the woods or out the back pasture or whatever. These people were positive that they'd seen a large black cat. And of course, the Wisconsin DNR doesn't want to acknowledge that these things are here.
Nope.
And I'm not even sure whether they're here in the physical sense. Like, there's a breeding population. And the fact that they're seen in the UK, they're seen in Australia, they're seen in Nebraska, they're seen
all
in
over,
Wisconsin.
man. Yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah. I mean, Kentucky's got a long history. I mean, there's even Nathan Isaac, who I think Nathan Isaac. He's done some pretty amazing research into the ancient black cat thing. And there was I think some sect of the Hopewell tribe, I think, had like a black cat cult and they had like a lot of iconography of the black cat coming out of cornfields and stuff like that. And it was interesting where these black cats were popping up in the 1800s. This is also the exact location where people were talking about going up at the top of the hill on Riverfront Drive and watching the lights all up into the 60s. Like people would have picnics up there and watch the floating like orange lights above the Missouri River. But it was just normal to them. They didn't like associate any. They was like, well, these lights are some kind of natural phenomenon. They're really cool. And they would play tricks with barges going down the Missouri River. They would be like shining their lights and like torches at them, and they would just like these lights would play with them. But at this area is so deeply weird. I mean, there's Bigfoot reports, flying wing humanoids. There's a nuclear power plant right on the river, and through the Freedom of Information Act, it's actually a Black Vault John Greenwald. There's this very dramatic, massive, like, triangular UFO that was hovering above the power plant for like 3 nights in a row in the late 80s. And it's just such a small, unpopulated area, and it's just got this high concentration of weirdness going way back. And Ray Boucher, who is a researcher, who is kind of the protagonist of Nick Redfern's Final Events book. He is an old school Fortean. He's the keeper of all the folklore of Nebraska. And when I moved back here, I had like a Zoom meeting with him. So I was just trying to pick his brain, get his advice. He's like, you need to go to Otoe County by the Missouri River and collect stories. This is historically the most going off place. And he said, because Ray talked to John Keel when he was 15 years old. He had this correspondence. Yeah. And John Keel was just coming up with the term window area. And he told Ray, well, I had this new term I call these places where a lot of the stuff happens. It's called a window area. And I think you have one. And so, yeah. But it's a fascinating area with a really long, interesting history too, because I always find, not always, but like, well, you know what's weird? I don't know how much you're going to get into true crime, but like just south of this area, there is this county called Richardson County, and I think it's the least populated county in Nebraska. Nothing is out there, but it's right on the corners of like Missouri and Kansas. So it's got kind of this geographical liminality about it. But there is just the craziest true crime in the state's history. There was a cult called the Yahweh cult. I'm not going to go into great detail because it's the most heinous, disgusting, crazy stuff you've ever heard of in your life. But it was an end times cult in the 80s that were out of the Posse Comitas. They're kind of early militia movement.
Gotcha.
It's a fascinating story, but horrific. And then right by there, like 5 miles away from there, was the Brendan Tina story, which is that movie Boys Don't Cry. It was an Oscar-winning film with Hilary Swank. That happened right there. And then there also happens to be the biggest Nazi propagandist in North America lives right there, pushing out like old like neo-Nazi books. And he's the biggest in the world. I mean, it's just like, why does this one county have so much weird stuff? I could go on and on. I could talk about for hours about this county and why it's so weird. And I don't know why.
There's a book there.
There is. It's some of the stuff is so dark that I'm like, oh my Lord. I mean, like I'm interested in true crime just because I keep on stumbling upon it when I'm looking into high strange cases. Because like I tend to like really like immerse myself in these like areas where a lot of this stuff happens in Nebraska and Iowa. And in order to do that, I really feel like I must understand the history, pre-settlers, as far back as I can get. And when I start looking about the history and the culture of the area and what different folklores were being brought over from where, a clear picture starts to come together. And it's hard to explain why, but like maybe it's just you get the history of the area, the magical place in your bones. And I think it's really important when you're investigating states or certain regions of the country.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I said there's a book there might also be a documentary there.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I would love to do one.
Is there a weird? I know there's the Weird USA books, like Linda Godfrey co-wrote Weird Wisconsin, which was the first one I discovered, and there's weird all over the places, almost every state you can think of. But is there a Weird Nebraska book? I'm not even sure if there is.
No, I mean there's the Ghosts of Lincoln, Nebraska, or Hauntings of Omaha, but there's not really like a weird, like a all-purpose weird handbook for Nebraska.
So that series didn't end up doing a Weird Nebraska.
No, Nebraska Nebraska is a tragically uncovered place in terms of like Fortean stories. And so, not that I'm doing it for any fame and fortune, but like, eventually I will write a book. So what I do is I go out and kind of investigate this stuff with historians or librarians have been my greatest asset, to be honest, of these small little towns. They are so helpful. But I will do kind of like, almost like, and sometimes I'll look into a certain place for a year, and I'm always writing about it, almost like journaling. And they kind of work as like chapters for a future book that 9 people will read. I mean, I don't think people are clamoring for a Weird Nebraska book, but I just want some place to put all this information so some young version of myself one day can go, man, someone saved these stories.
Is that your instinct, is to do a book rather than a documentary? Because I know you're also immersed in the film world.
Yeah, I mean, I would love. I mean, like I have like all these documentaries I would dream about doing. But that would be great. It really would. I would love to do that. I mean, honestly, it'd probably be easier for me to get that off the ground and get it going, and I think more people would see it if I did a documentary. Like,
Could do a companion. You could do a companion book to the documentary.
Right. That would kind of be the ultimate way, where it's like, the documentary is a taste, but the book is the full story. But it would be fun. It would be a real dream. I have very little experience in the documentary world, but I could figure it out, man. You'd help me, right, Dean? You give me some suggestions.
I'd absolutely help you. Nathan would help you as well, I'm sure. Everybody will.
Well, Nathan and I actually shot a project last summer that we're getting close to.
Can you talk a little bit about that, or is that still top secret?
I can tell you like a little. We're trying to not tell too many people, but it's basically like I'll call it a show for now, but like it's about 2 dudes, Nathan and I, who are fascinated with folklore and the magic of place in certain areas. And so the idea would be we go to a certain location and deep dive. Like it's almost like one of those things where like for the bad example is like, we're going to do an episode about the Skinwalker Ranch. We're not going to do that, but like, just for an example. But what would happen? The idea of the show is like one event is led you there, but we're really looking at everything else other than the event. Because I don't think anyone needs another doc series where they're covering Skinwalker Ranch or, a lot of these cases we've heard ad nauseum over and over again. But what we are into, and what I'm very much into, is what was happening around the area, and like what was happening in the town. What was going on with the people? Was there like weird, Nathan's into the same thing, clearly like where like, he looks into one thing in Somerset, Kentucky, and then comes out with 100 different, things. And so I've kind of found I think that will happen no matter what. If you're taking a small little microcosm of, let's say the area around you, the county, a couple counties around you, you're going to, maybe it's one event, a Bigfoot story that gets you out there to start researching, investigating. But what will happen is you'll find all this other stuff that becomes just as or more interesting, I think.
Man, speaking about interesting, this was such an interesting chat with you. I have to have you back on, and we could have just have stayed talking about UFO weirdness for the whole show. But I'm glad we segued into Weird Nebraska, because it's something I knew so little about. And again, that's probably because nobody has written the Weird Nebraska book. So again, I want to do it just so somebody one day has a place they can easily pick up, go, here's a bunch of weird stories, like just because I wish someone had done that, for me when I was a kid, So is there anywhere you'd like people to go now to see what you're up to, or to see what's coming? Do you have a URL or?
Well, you can find my podcast Hi. It's Hi, like I'm saying hello to Strangeness, HI, Strangeness. You can find that at Apple, YouTube, Spotify, all those places. And also, I guess my social media is Berg Master 5000, and it's kind of through all the social media platforms. But yeah, that's what I'm up to. And if you're interested in my like film or TV work, you can IMDb that and find some of that. I've been, I guess, a decent amount of TV shows and movies and stuff. So check it out if you want, or don't.
Man, you've been in a bunch of stuff. And High Strangeness, as I said earlier, is such a great show. I have a link, I think, in the show notes to the YouTube channel if people want to watch the video, but they can find it in at any podcast platform, whether it's
Easy to
Apple
find.
or Spotify or wherever they get their things. But thank you so much for coming on, Steve. We got to get you back again because I could talk to you for like several hours and just not stop.
Oh, you too, Dean. Thanks so much, buddy. I mean, like I love the episode we did. I mean, I could talk shaver lore, buddy, for days. That's my sweet spot. And also, folks, if you haven't seen, I mean, I've got to see some of Dean's work, and you're in for a real treat if you haven't seen it yet. I mean, I love what you're doing. What you're doing is exactly the stuff I want to watch. So, thank you.
Man, you're way too kind. I think you're the only guest I've ever had on who's pimped my stuff instead
Yeah.
of your own at the end. And I'll feed off that the next screening is at the PK Dick Film Festival in New York in early April. If they want to see The Shaver Mystery, which is the short film, which you've all heard me rant about, and you've heard Steve say very nicely.
It's so good. I mean, I'm not just blowing smoke or buttering your biscuits, pal. It's the truth.
Well, man, until I get to talk to you again, though, Steve, and until I get to talk to everybody else out there, please keep it weird.